Right now, in forests across the planet, the oldest conversations on Earth are happening. Not in words, not in sound, in chemistry, in electrical pulses, in signals moving through wood and soil at speeds we once thought impossible. Trees are speaking. They've been speaking for 385 million years. We thought stillness meant silence. We thought roots meant isolation. We were wrong about both. A coast redwood can live for 2,000 years. A giant sequoia, 3,000. Bristlecone pines push past 5,000. These aren't just old organisms. They're minds operating on timescales we can barely comprehend. While you've lived your entire life, a single sequoia has added perhaps 30 rings to its trunk. Your childhood is a thin line in its wood, your whole existence barely visible. But here's what we missed, that slowness isn't limitation. It's a different kind of thinking. When you have 3,000 years to solve a problem, you solve it differently. When your roots touch 1,000 other root systems, you don't think alone. When your memory is written in wood that never forgets, you carry history in your body. What we're about to discover changes everything we thought we knew about intelligence, about memory, about what it means to think at all. Because trees don't have brains, they don't have neurons, they don't have anything we'd recognize as a nervous system, and yet they make decisions. They learn from experience, they communicate warnings, they recognize their own offspring, they remember droughts from decades ago and change their behavior accordingly. The question isn't whether trees think. The question is, what does thinking look like when you have 3,000 years to do it? This is Omni, stories about life, matter, and the mystery in between. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe if you believe curiosity should never end. Picture a single giant sequoia in the Sierra Nevada, standing where it stood for 2,800 years. You're looking at its base, a trunk wider than a small house, bark thick as a mattress, furrowed deep enough to lose your hand in the crevices. The bark is cinnamon red, fibrous, soft to the touch despite the tree's obvious strength. Fire scars run up one side, black char from blazes this tree survived centuries ago. Your hand rests against the trunk. The bark is warm from afternoon sun. Inside, beneath your palm, something is happening. Water is moving, not flowing. Moving is the wrong word for something this slow, this patient, rising, climbing. Against gravity, against physics as we usually understand it, water is travelling from roots buried 30 feet underground up through 280 feet of trunk to needles at the crown you can barely see from here. It's making this journey at about 2 inches per hour in the main trunk. At that speed, a water molecule absorbed by a root this morning won't reach a leaf until 3 days from now. 3 days of continuous travel through tubes narrower than a human hair, pulled upward by forces we're still trying to fully understand. And here's what makes it impossible. This tree is 280 feet tall. The maximum height water can be pulled by suction, by vacuum pressure, is about 33 feet, the height of a 3-story building. Beyond that, physics says no. The water column should break, air bubbles should form, the whole system should fail. But it doesn't fail. It works. It's been working since before Rome was founded, before the pyramids were built, before humans had written language. According to research by George Koch at Northern Arizona University, the tallest trees on Earth are performing a trick that should be thermodynamically impossible. They're pulling water to heights that violate basic physics, except they're not violating it. They're using principles we only recently discovered: cohesion and adhesion at the molecular level, surface tension strong enough to create negative pressure, suction stronger than any vacuum pump humans have ever built. The tree is a physics engine running calculations in wood and water, but that's just transport. That's just keeping itself alive. What about the other thing? The thing we didn't think trees could do at all? What about thinking? Step back from the trunk. Walk 20 feet to the next sequoia, then the next. You're in a grove now, a cluster of giants, maybe 50 trees, all within 100 yards of each other. Some are massive, 3,000 years old. Some are younger, barely 500. Some are saplings, thin as your wrist, struggling in the shadow of their elders. They look separate, individual organisms competing for light, for water, for space. That's what we thought for centuries. That's what textbooks taught. But beneath your feet, under the needles and duff and topsoil, something else is happening. The roots of these trees, roots that spread wider than the trees are, tall, that dive 60 feet deep in some places, are touching. Not just touching, fused, connected. In some cases, you literally cannot tell where one tree's root system ends and another's begins. They've grown together, grafted at contact points, merged their vascular systems. And even where they're not physically touching, they're connected through something else, something we only discovered in the last 40 years. Fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi, to be specific. Microscopic threads called hyphae that wrap around tree roots, penetrate between root cells, and form partnerships older than forests themselves. The fungi connect to one root, then extend through the soil to another root, another tree, another species sometimes. They create a network, a web of living connections linking every tree in the forest to every other tree. Scientists call it the mycorrhizal network. Some call it the wood wide web. Through this network, trees share, they trade, they communicate. Suzanne Simard at the University of British Columbia has spent 30 years mapping these networks in Canadian forests. Her experiments showed something that seemed impossible. Trees transfer carbon to each other through fungal networks, not just randomly, strategically. A large Douglas fir will send carbon through the network to smaller firs struggling in its shade. Mother trees, she calls them. Hub trees with massive root systems connected to dozens or hundreds of younger trees, supporting them, keeping them alive until they can reach the canopy. But it's not just food being shared, it's information. When a tree is attacked by insects, it releases chemical signals into the air, volatiles that warn neighbouring trees. We've known this for decades, but what Simard and others discovered is that the warning also travels underground. Through the fungal network, faster than airborne chemicals can diffuse. A tree under attack sends signals through its roots to the fungi, and the fungi carry that signal to connected trees. Those trees, before any insects reach them, begin producing defensive compounds. They prepare. They adapt their chemistry based on a warning from a neighbour they cannot see. The forest is thinking collectively, processing threats, responding as a system. You're still standing in the sequoia grove. The tree in front of you was a seedling when the Roman Empire fell. It has lived through the entire span of human civilization as we understand it. It has weathered droughts we have no record of. It has survived fires that burned for weeks. It has watched hundreds of generations of every other organism in this forest live and die. And it remembers. Not the way you remember, not with a brain forming patterns from electrical signals, not with neurons encoding experience, but it remembers nonetheless. A tree that survives a severe drought will, decades later, respond to mild water stress more conservatively. It will close its stomata earlier. It will slow its growth preemptively. Research by William Anderegg at the University of Utah shows that trees carry forward the memory of past stress in their physiology, adjusting their risk tolerance based on history. The memory is written in gene expression patterns, in epigenetic markers, in the physical structure of xylem vessels formed during that drought year. The wood itself is memory, every ring a record, every cell a note in a log that never stops being written. And here's where it becomes strange in a way that feels almost conscious. Trees recognize kin. Douglas firs can distinguish their own offspring from unrelated seedlings. When grown in experimental plots, mother trees send more carbon through the mycorrhizal network to their own young than to strangers. They invest preferentially in their genetic legacy. Somehow, through signals we're only beginning to identify, a tree knows which roots belong to its children. That's not automatic chemistry. That's not a simple response to a stimulus. That's recognition. That's selective behaviour based on relationship. If an animal did this, we'd call it intelligence without hesitation. But trees don't just remember and recognise, they anticipate. In temperate forests, trees prepare for winter months in advance. Deciduous trees begin moving nutrients out of their leaves in late summer, long before the first frost, long before day length alone would trigger dormancy. They're predicting, using their internal circadian clocks, using accumulated temperature data, using signals we still don't fully understand. they forecast the coming season and adjust accordingly. A paper in Nature Plants by Wolfgang Busch showed that plants can essentially learn from experience, conditioning their responses based on repeated exposure to environmental patterns. If a particular sequence of events predicts a stressful condition, the plant will begin responding to the early signals in that sequence, preemptively defending itself before the stress actually arrives. That's associative learning. That's pattern recognition applied to future events. That's thinking in slow motion. You place your hand back on the sequoia's trunk. The bark is still warm. The tree is still here, as it's been here for longer than most nations have existed. Somewhere inside, water is climbing. Carbon is being fixed into sugar. Signals are moving through fungal networks to neighbouring trees. Rings are forming, one per year, recording this moment into a physical archive that will persist for millennia. The tree isn't just alive, it's aware, not in the way you're aware with thoughts that flow and shift moment to moment, but aware in a deeper, slower way. Aware of light and dark, of wet and dry, of the chemical signatures of insects and the presence of other trees. Aware, perhaps, of time itself in a way no animal could ever be. Tonight, we're going to follow that awareness down into the wood and out through the roots. We'll trace the signals moving through forests at speeds, measured in hours and days. We'll watch trees solve problems over decades and remember events over centuries. We'll ask what consciousness looks like when you can't move, can't speak, can't do anything but stand and sense and slowly, patiently respond. Because understanding tree intelligence doesn't just change how we see trees, it changes how we understand intelligence itself. Maybe a mind doesn't require speed. Maybe thinking doesn't require neurons. Maybe consciousness isn't something you have. It's something you do, over whatever timescale your biology allows. And maybe the oldest, slowest minds on Earth have been thinking thoughts we're only now learning to hear. Let's begin where all tree intelligence begins, with a single cell sensing light and deciding which way to grow. Maybe intelligence begins with a question simpler than we ever imagined. Which way is up? A seed falls, lands in soil, sits there in darkness, waiting for rain, for warmth, for the precise combination of conditions that tells it, now. The seed coat splits. Inside, a tiny embryo activates, drawing on stored energy, committing to the irreversible process of germination. And immediately it faces a problem that will define its entire existence. It cannot move. Once that root emerges, once it anchors, the plant will spend its life in exactly that spot. No second chances, no wandering to find better conditions. Everything depends on making the right decisions from the very beginning, rooted in place. So the embryo does something remarkable. It senses gravity. Inside the root tip, in specialized cells called statocytes, tiny dense organelles called amyloplasts, essentially starch-filled bags, settle to the bottom of each cell due to gravity, always down. These organelles press against the cell membrane, triggering a cascade of signals. Calcium ions flow, proteins activate, gene expression changes, and the root, responding to this purely physical cue, begins growing downward. At the same time, the shoot does the opposite. Different cells, different sensors, but the same principle. The shoot detects which way is down, then grows the opposite direction, up, toward where light should be, even though the seedling hasn't encountered light yet. It's predicting, using gravity as a proxy for orientation, betting its entire life on this one decision. According to research by Patrick Masson at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, this gravitropic response is so fundamental that mutant plants lacking it simply cannot survive in nature. They grow sideways, or coil, or point randomly. They fail before they begin. The ability to sense and respond to gravity isn't optional. It's the foundation of everything else. But once that seedling breaks through the soil surface and encounters light, everything changes. Light is information, not just energy for photosynthesis. Information about where to grow, when to grow, how to shape itself. And plants have evolved sensors that would make any tech company jealous. They have at least 11 different types of photoreceptors, 11 different molecular systems dedicated solely to detecting and responding to light. Some detect blue light, some detect red, some detect far red, wavelengths just beyond what human eyes can see. Some detect UV. Each photoreceptor triggers different responses, different developmental programs. Phytochromes, for instance, detect the ratio of red to far red light. This ratio tells a plant something critical. Is it shaded? When sunlight passes through a leaf, chlorophyll absorbs red light for photosynthesis, but reflects far red. So a low red to far red ratio means the plant is under a canopy in someone else's shadow. This triggers shade avoidance syndrome, rapid stem elongation, prioritizing height over lateral growth, betting everything on reaching the canopy before it starves. A seedling in deep shade will grow 3 times faster vertically than the same seedling in full sun. It's reallocating resources, taking risks. If it doesn't reach light soon, the stored energy in its cotyledons will run out and it will die. So it gambles, thin stems, fewer leaves, everything dedicated to height. That's a strategic decision based on sensory input and probabilistic outcomes. That's calculation happening in cellulose and chlorophyll. But trees don't just sense light and gravity. They sense touch. Bend a sapling, and it will grow thicker at the point of stress. Repeatedly brush against a young tree and it will develop shorter, stockier proportions, a phenomenon called thigmomorphogenesis. The tree is literally feeling mechanical stress and restructuring its body in response. In forests, this means trees growing on windy ridges develop different architecture than trees in sheltered valleys. Same species, same genetics, but different bodies sculpted by different physical forces. The tree feels the wind and builds accordingly. Research by Olivier Hamon at the Institut National de Recherche pour l'Agriculture shows that plants sense mechanical stress at the cellular level through mechanosensitive ion channels in their membranes. When cells are stretched or compressed, these channels open, ions flood in, and signaling cascades begin. Within minutes, genes involved in cell wall reinforcement activate. Within days, new growth responds to the stress pattern. The tree doesn't have pain receptors. It doesn't feel touch the way you do, but it senses physical force and modifies its behavior adaptively. That's proprioception. That's body awareness. And it gets stranger. Trees sense chemistry. Obviously, they have to sense nutrients in the soil, know when to open stomata, detect hormones. But they also sense chemicals they've never encountered before. Chemicals that only exist because of human industry. Ozone. Trees in polluted areas detect ozone damage and adjust their stomatal behavior, closing earlier in the day to minimize exposure. They're responding to a molecule that didn't exist in significant concentrations until the Industrial Revolution. They've never evolved with this chemical, and yet they sense it, recognize it as harmful, and modify their behavior within days. That's not genetic programming. That's not a receptor evolved to detect a specific molecule over millions of years. That's general-purpose chemical sensing applied to novel threats. According to research by Elena Paletti at the Italian National Research Council, trees also detect and respond to volatile organic compounds from neighbouring plants, including compounds released by plants they've never shared an ecosystem with. Put a European tree next to an Asian tree in an experimental plot, and they'll still respond to each other's chemical signals, even though they've never encountered those exact molecules in their evolutionary history. The sensing isn't specific, it's flexible, adaptable. The tree is essentially smelling its environment and making decisions based on chemical information, even when that information is completely novel. But perhaps the most sophisticated sensing happens underground, where roots navigate through darkness using cues we're only beginning to understand. A root tip is exploring, constantly growing forward, about 1 millimeter per hour in some species, much faster in others. But it's not growing blind. The root cap, the protective tissue at the very tip, is packed with sensors, gravity sensors as we discussed, but also moisture sensors, nutrient sensors, oxygen sensors, pH sensors. A root will grow toward water, hydrotropism. If you create a moisture gradient in soil, the root will curve toward the wetter side, even if that means growing upward against gravity. Water trumps gravity in the decision tree. A root will grow toward phosphorus, toward nitrogen, toward other essential nutrients. Different roots in the same root system will specialize, some prioritizing water, some prioritizing nutrients, each making independent decisions about where to explore. And here's what makes it computational. Roots integrate multiple signals simultaneously. A root might detect moisture to the left and nutrients to the right. It will make a decision based on the plant's current most urgent need. If the plant is water stressed, the root curves left. If the plant is nitrogen limited, the root curves right. The same root, facing the same environmental cues, makes different decisions based on internal state. That's context-dependent behavior. That's weighing options and choosing based on priorities. Research by Ariel Novoplansky at Ben-Gurion University shows that roots also sense and avoid roots from other plants, even other individuals of the same species. Put two seedlings near each other, and their roots will actively grow away from contact points. They're detecting chemical signals from neighbouring roots and treating them as competitors to avoid. But, and this is critical, a plant's own roots don't avoid each other. Somehow, a root system distinguishes self from non-self. It recognises its own roots through chemical signatures and treats them differently than foreign roots. Multiple roots from the same plant will grow past each other, overlap, even fuse. Roots from different plants maintain separation. That's self-recognition. That's an identity boundary maintained through chemistry. If you are designing an AI system to navigate a complex three-dimensional environment with limited resources, avoiding competitors while cooperating with your distributed parts, integrating multiple sensory streams to make real-time decisions about where to invest energy, you'd build something that looks exactly like a root system. The tree is already doing it, has been doing it for 385 million years, doing it without a brain, without central coordination, through distributed sensing and local decision-making that somehow produces coherent, adaptive behavior at the whole organism level. But sensing is only half the story. The other half is what happens after sensing, how the information travels, how it's processed, how it leads to action. And that's where trees do something we never expected, something that looks an awful lot like thinking. In 1873, a Scottish botanist named John Burdon Sanderson did something unusual. He attached electrodes to a Venus flytrap. He wasn't studying trees, he was studying this carnivorous oddity that seemed to move like an animal, snapping shut in 1/10 of a second when triggered. And what he found shocked the scientific community. The Venus flytrap generates electrical signals, action potentials. The same kind of electrical impulses that travel through your nerves were travelling through plant tissue. For over a century, this was treated as a curiosity, an exception. Carnivorous plants were weird, sure, but normal plants, trees, grasses, crops, they didn't have electrical signalling. They were fundamentally different from animals. Chemical organisms, not electrical ones. We were wrong. In the last 20 years, researchers using modern electrode technology and fluorescent voltage sensors have discovered that all plants generate electrical signals. Every plant, every species tested. The signals are slower than animal nerve impulses, travelling at centimetres per second instead of meters per second. But they're there, constantly, carrying information through the plant body. And they matter. They're not vestigial. They're not accidents. They're how plants make decisions in real time. When you wound a leaf, the damaged cells release glutamate, the same neurotransmitter that neurons use to communicate in your brain. This glutamate opens calcium channels in neighbouring cells. Calcium floods in, triggering a voltage spike, an action potential. This electrical wave propagates through the plant, moving from cell to cell through plasmodesmata, the tiny channels connecting plant cells. Within seconds, the signal reaches other leaves. Within minutes, it reaches the roots. And everywhere this electrical signal travels, it triggers responses. Genes activate. Defensive compounds begin production. The entire plant shifts into defense mode based on damage detected in a single leaf. According to work by Masatsugu Toyota at Saitama University, this electrical signaling isn't just a simple alarm, it's information-rich. Different types of damage, insect feeding, mechanical tearing, pathogen infection, produce different electrical signature patterns, and the plant responds differently to each pattern. Cut a leaf with scissors, and the plant will reinforce cell walls in neighbouring tissue. Let a caterpillar chew the same leaf, and the plant will additionally produce compounds that attract parasitic wasps, the caterpillar's natural predators. Same tissue, same damage in a gross physical sense, but the plant distinguishes between them and responds appropriately. That's pattern recognition. That's categorizing threats and deploying targeted responses. But electrical signals aren't just for defense. They coordinate behavior. When a tree opens its stomata, the tiny pores on leaf surfaces that allow gas exchange, it has to make a complex decision. Open stomata too wide, and the tree loses water through transpiration, risking drought stress. Keep them too closed and photosynthesis slows, risking starvation. The optimal strategy depends on soil moisture, air humidity, light levels, temperature, wind speed, and the tree's current carbon and water status. No single leaf can know all of this. A leaf high in the canopy has no direct information about soil moisture 20 feet below. Roots have no direct information about whether clouds just block the sun, so the tree integrates. Roots sensing dry soil send electrical signals upward. These signals trigger the production of abscisic acid, a hormone that causes stomata to close. The hormone moves through the vascular system, but the electrical signal arrives first, minutes ahead of the hormone, priming the stomatal cells to respond. Meanwhile, leaves are generating their own electrical signals based on local light and humidity. These signals propagate downward, informing the roots about above-ground conditions. The result is a feedback system, distributed sensing, electrical signaling for rapid coordination, hormonal signaling for sustained responses. The tree is running a control algorithm in biological hardware, constantly adjusting thousands of stomata across its entire crown based on integrated information from roots, trunk, and leaves. Research by Rainer Hedrick at the University of Würzburg has shown that this integration happens fast enough to matter. When light levels suddenly increase, clouds parting for instance, electrical signals precede stomatal opening by several minutes. The plant is preparing for the change before it fully manifests. That's anticipatory control. That's predictive processing. And then there's the Venus flytrap problem, the one Burden Sanderson first documented, the one that still challenges our assumptions about what plants can do. Remember, the Venus flytrap counts. One touch to a trigger hair does nothing. 2 touches within roughly 20 seconds, and the trap snaps shut. The plant is holding information in short-term memory and making a decision based on temporal pattern recognition. How? Hedrick's team figured it out. The first touch generates an action potential, an electrical spike, but that spike alone doesn't reach the threshold needed to trigger the motor cells that close the trap. The voltage change is stored as elevated calcium concentration inside cells. This calcium level decays slowly over about 20 seconds. If a second touch occurs while calcium is still elevated, it generates a second action, potential on top of the first signal. Now the combined voltage change crosses the threshold. Mechanoreceptor proteins in the motor cells activate. Water rapidly flows out of cells on the outer surface of the trap lobes. Turgor pressure drops. The lobes, previously held open by this pressure, suddenly collapse inward. The trap snaps shut, and it happens in 100 milliseconds, one of the fastest movements in the entire plant kingdom, powered by hydraulics and electricity. But here's what makes it computational. The plant is integrating signals over time, storing state information, and making a threshold-based decision. That's the same basic logic a neuron uses to decide whether to fire. Different molecules, different timescales, but the same information processing architecture. And Venus flytraps aren't unique in their sophistication, they're just visible. Easy to study because the behavior is dramatic and fast. Other plants are doing similar computations, just slower, less obviously. Mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant, folds its leaves when touched. The signal travels through the plant as an electrical wave, and leaves along the entire stem respond in sequence, collapsing one after another. The plant is processing the location of the touch, and propagating the response systematically through its body. Tomato plants under herbivore attack will begin producing defensive compounds in unattacked tissue before the herbivore arrives there. Somehow they're predicting where the threat will move and preparing accordingly. Arabidopsis plants exposed to sound frequencies matching those of a chewing caterpillar will produce defense compounds even when no actual herbivore is present. The plant is responding to acoustic information, vibrations traveling through leaves, and interpreting those vibrations as threat indicators. Research by Heidi Appel and Reginald Cocroft at the University of Missouri showed this isn't a response to just any sound. Play wind noise, insect songs, or music to the plants, and they don't respond. Only the specific frequency signature of chewing triggers the defense response. The plant is filtering acoustic information, distinguishing signal from noise, responding selectively to relevant patterns. That's sensory processing. That's feature detection in a system with no ears, no neurons, no brain. So if plants can process information this way, electrically, temporally, integrating multiple signals to make decisions, what's the difference between this and thinking? The usual answer is consciousness. Sure, plants process information, but they're not aware of it. They're not experiencing anything, they're just running algorithms like a thermostat or a computer. But that's where the argument gets tricky. You're not consciously aware of most of your own information processing. Your visual cortex is constantly detecting edges, motion, colours, patterns, processing immense amounts of data, and almost none of it reaches conscious awareness unless you deliberately pay attention. Your body regulates temperature, pH, blood pressure, hormone levels, immune responses, constant sophisticated decisions happening below the threshold of consciousness. Are those processes thinking? Most neuroscientists would say yes, they're cognitive processes, just non-conscious ones. Your brain is thinking about balance when you walk, even though you're not aware of the specific motor commands being issued. So why is a tree's regulation of stomatal aperture based on integrated information about water status, light levels, and carbon needs considered mere reaction rather than cognition? The philosopher Michael Marder argues that we've confused consciousness with cognition. Consciousness, subjective experience, the feeling of what it's like to be something, may be unique to animals with certain nervous system architectures, but cognition, information processing that produces adaptive behavior, is much broader. A tree doesn't experience pain when it's damaged, probably. It doesn't have feelings, doesn't suffer, doesn't possess an inner mental life anything like ours. But it processes information about damage. It distinguishes types of threats. It coordinates responses across its entire body. It makes decisions, conditional, context-dependent choices among possible behaviors. That's cognition. That's thinking, even if it's not conscious thinking. And there's a deeper implication here, one that challenges how we understand intelligence itself. We've always assumed that thinking requires speed, that intelligence correlates with processing velocity. Neurons fire in milliseconds. Thoughts happen in seconds. That's what makes cognition possible, we believed. But what if speed is just an adaptation to mobility? You need to think fast because you move fast, because your environment changes rapidly, because you're a predator or prey navigating a dynamic world. Trees don't move. Their environment changes, but slowly, over seasons, years, decades. They don't need rapid cognition. They need patient cognition. Processing that happens over days or weeks, integrating information across timescales no animal experiences. When a tree decides whether to invest resources in growth or defense, it's not making that decision in seconds. It's integrating months of environmental data, temperature patterns, water availability, herbivore pressure, light levels, and adjusting its resource allocation accordingly. The decision emerges slowly, from accumulated information, from patterns that only become clear when you're tracking time in seasons rather than seconds. That's not less intelligent. It's intelligent in a different time domain, and it might be better suited to the problems trees face than our fast, nervous cognition would be. Because trees are solving optimization problems at scales we can barely comprehend, allocating resources across millions of leaves, coordinating the growth of thousands of root tips, balancing immediate needs against long-term survival in an organism that might live for thousands of years. They're doing it without a brain, through distributed processing in every cell, every tissue, every organ, making local decisions that somehow, collectively, produce coherent behavior at the level of the whole organism. That's not simple. That's not mechanical. That's a form of intelligence we're only beginning to understand, and only because we've finally started asking the right questions. But if trees can think without brains, can they also remember without neurons? Can they learn without a hippocampus? The answer is yes, and the mechanism is as elegant as it is strange. In 2014, a team of researchers did something strange. They played a recording to a group of pea plants. Not music, not words, just the sound of a running water, a gentle trickling, the acoustic signature of moisture moving through soil. The plants were in Y-shaped tubes with speakers at the end of each arm. One speaker played the water sound, the other played silence or random noise or recordings of other sounds. The roots grew toward the water sound, consistently, reliably. Even when there was no actual water present, just the recording, roots curved toward the speaker, playing water sounds, and away from speakers playing other sounds. Monica Galliano at the University of Western Australia published the results, and the scientific community reacted with skepticism. Plants responding to the sound of water. That seemed like magical thinking, like the kind of thing that belonged in fringe agriculture blogs, not peer-reviewed journals. But then other labs replicated it. And then Gagliano did something more remarkable. She trained the pea plants. The setup was simple, borrowed directly from classical conditioning experiments. Pavlov's dogs, essentially, but with plants. She exposed plants to blue light paired with airflow from a fan. Blue light alone triggers phototropism, growth toward the light source. Airflow alone does nothing. But after several training sessions, blue light plus fan, repeated pairings, she tested the plants with just the fan. No light, just air movement. The plants grew toward the fan. They had learned to associate the fan with light. They were responding to a cue that predicted a resource, even when the resource itself wasn't present. That's associative learning. That's Pavlovian conditioning in an organism with no nervous system. And the memory persisted. Plants tested days after training still showed the conditioned response. Not forever. The memory decayed over time, as you'd expect. But it lasted long enough to matter. Long enough to be called memory in any reasonable definition of the term. The mechanism, as far as we understand it, involves calcium signaling and changes in gene expression. The repeated pairing of stimuli triggers epigenetic modifications, chemical tags added to DNA that change how genes are read without changing the underlying genetic code. These modifications persist for days or weeks, creating a physical trace of past experience that influences future behavior. The plant remembers through chemistry, through molecular patterns that encode "this happened before." But pea plants in laboratories are one thing. What about trees in forests experiencing decades or centuries of environmental conditions? Do they remember too? Yes, and the memories run deep. Consider drought memory. When a tree experiences severe water stress, a multi-year drought, the kind that pushes it to the edge of survival, it changes. Not just temporarily, permanently in some ways. William Anderegg's research at the University of Utah tracked individual pinon pines through and after a major drought in the American Southwest. Some trees experienced severe stress, losing most of their needles, shutting down large portions of their vascular system. Others, in slightly better microsites, experienced only moderate stress. Years after the drought ended, after rainfall returned to normal, the severely stressed trees still behaved differently. They were more conservative with water use. They closed their stomata earlier in the day. They invested more in root growth relative to canopy growth. Their wood anatomy changed. They produced vessels with smaller diameters, less efficient for water transport but more resistant to cavitation, to embolisms forming in the xylem during future droughts. The trees remembered the drought and restructured themselves accordingly. They became more risk-averse, more defensive, prioritizing survival over growth even when conditions were favourable. And this memory is written in their bodies, in the structure of wood formed during and after the drought, in the expression patterns of stress response genes that remain elevated years later, in the architecture of root systems that expanded underground while canopies stayed small. A tree ring isn't just a record of age, it's a record of experience. Wide rings from good years, narrow rings from drought years, from fire years, from outbreaks of defoliating insects. Every ring is a page in a diary written in cellulose, documenting the tree's entire life in a format that never degrades, never gets overwritten. You can core a 500-year-old Douglas fir and read its history. Here, a drought in 1847. Here, a fire in 1763 that scarred but didn't kill it. Here, a period of suppression in the 1680s when it grew under a canopy. then sudden release when a neighbouring tree fell and light flooded in. The tree carries its past in every cell of its trunk. The past shapes the present, literally, physically. Old wood provides structural support, vascular capacity, a foundation on which new growth builds. You can't separate the tree from its history. It is its history, accumulated and integrated every year of its life still present in its body. But trees don't just remember their own experiences, they remember each other. Suzanne Simard's work on mycorrhizal networks revealed something unexpected about tree death. When a large hub tree, a mother tree with extensive connections to younger trees, is dying, it dumps resources into the network. Carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, nutrients it will never use, flow through fungal connections to surrounding trees, especially to its offspring. It's not conscious altruism. The dying tree isn't choosing to be generous. But it's a behaviour that persists because it works, because trees whose genes include, when dying, release resources to the network, leave more surviving offspring than trees that hold resources until death. And the receiving trees? They respond. They increase their investment in the mycorrhizal fungi, they strengthen the connections. In some documented cases, they even alter their root structure, growing toward the dying tree, maximising contact with the network while resources are available. The forest remembers it's dead through the networks they built, through the resources they released, through the spatial patterns of growth that persist for decades after the original tree is gone. You can sometimes identify where a large tree once stood by the ring of slightly larger trees surrounding the empty space, offspring that benefited from their mother's final transfer, growing faster than they otherwise would have. That's multi-generational memory, information passing from parent to offspring not through genetics, but through behaviour, through resource transfer, through the physical legacy of networks that outlive individuals. And then there's the strangest form of tree memory, the one that seems most impossible, most like science fiction, transgenerational epigenetic memory. When a plant experiences stress, herbivore attack, drought, pathogen infection, it changes its gene expression through epigenetic modifications. Methyl groups attach to DNA. Histons, the proteins that package DNA, get chemically modified. These changes affect which genes are turned on or off without altering the DNA sequence itself. Most of these modifications are temporary. They fade when the stress ends, but some persist, and some, a small percentage but a real percentage, get passed to the next generation through seeds. Work by Lars Hennig at ETH Zurich and others has shown that plants exposed to stress can produce offspring that are primed to respond more strongly to the same stress, even if those offspring never experience it themselves. The parent's experience shapes the offspring's physiology through epigenetic inheritance. A tree that survives insect outbreak might produce seeds that express defense genes at higher baseline levels. Those seedlings, growing decades later in a forest with no outbreak, are nonetheless better defended because of what their parent experienced. The memory isn't just individual, it's heritable. It travels through time from one generation to the next, carrying information about environmental threats across decades or centuries. This isn't Lamarckian evolution. It's not genetic mutation based on use. But it's not purely genetic inheritance either. It's something in between. Soft inheritance, some biologists call it. A way for organisms to pass on not just genes, but gene expression patterns, not just potential, but preparation. And for long-lived organisms like trees, this matters enormously. A tree that produces seeds after surviving a major drought is sending those seeds into a future that's likely to contain more droughts. Climate is auto-correlated. Conditions tend to persist. So producing offspring primed for water stress is adaptive, increasing their survival probability. The tree is betting on the future based on the past, and encoding that bet in the epigenome of its seeds. But here's what makes all of this: the associative learning, the drought memory, the transgenerational inheritance, so philosophically challenging. None of it requires anything we'd traditionally call a memory system. No hippocampus consolidating short-term traces into long-term storage. No neurons encoding information in patterns of connectivity. No recall process, no retrieval, no conscious recollection. Just chemistry. Just molecules arranged in patterns that persist, that influence behavior, that carry information forward through time. And yet it's memory. By any functional definition, information about the past that influences present behaviour, it's memory, which means either our definition of memory is too narrow, too tied to animal neurobiology, or memory is a much more fundamental property of living systems than we've appreciated. Maybe memory isn't a thing brains do. Maybe memory is what happens when any system with feedback loops and persistent states experiences sequential events. Trees remember because they're complex enough to be changed by experience and structured enough for those changes to matter. The memory is in the wood, in the genes, in the networks. Not stored in some separate memory organ, but distributed across the entire organism, implicit in its structure. You're standing next to a tree that remembers the drought of 1987. It remembers through wood anatomy, through root structure, through gene expression patterns that still reflect that summer when the soil dried to dust and leaves curled against the heat. The tree doesn't recall the drought the way you recall yesterday, but it behaves differently because of it. It is different because of it. And that difference, that persistent change based on past experience, is memory in the deepest sense. Memory without a brain. Learning without neurons. Intelligence distributed across wood and roots and leaves, operating in time domains measured in seasons and years. And if trees can do all this, sense, process, remember, learn, while rooted in place, while operating at timescales that make our thoughts seem like lightning flashes, what else are they doing that we haven't noticed yet? What conversations are happening in the forest too slow for us to hear? Stand in a forest at dusk and try to see it the way a tree does. You can't, of course. Your perception is built for movement, for tracking objects across visual space, for processing the world in real-time streams of sensory data. You experience now as a narrow window, maybe a few seconds wide, everything before that fading into memory, everything after that undefined as future. A tree's now might span an entire season. Its sensory world isn't visual, it's chemical, mechanical, electrical. It doesn't track objects, it tracks gradients, concentrations, rates of change measured in days. When a tree notices that spring has arrived, it's not observing a single warm day. It's integrating weeks of temperature data, photoperiod measurements, soil moisture changes. The tree computes a weighted average of conditions and crosses some internal threshold. Begin growth, activate buds, start moving resources from roots to branches. By the time you notice the first leaf buds swelling, the tree has been thinking about spring for a month. This is what we missed for so long. We looked at trees through our own temporal lens, expecting to see behaviour on our timescale, communication at our speeds. When we saw nothing, we concluded there was nothing to see. But intelligence doesn't have a minimum clock speed. Cognition doesn't require rapid processing. Those are adaptations to specific ecological niches. Predators tracking prey, prey escaping predators, social animals coordinating in real time. Trees face different problems. How to survive in one location for thousands of years. How to allocate limited resources across enormous bodies. How to respond to threats that emerge slowly. Droughts developing over months, insect populations building over years, climate patterns shifting over decades. These problems require patience, not speed. Integration, not reflex. And trees have had 385 million years to optimize for exactly these challenges. The result is a form of intelligence that looks nothing like ours but works beautifully for what it needs to do. Consider again that giant sequoia, 3,000 years old, 280 feet tall, weighing several thousand tons. Every day it's making thousands of decisions. Which branches to grow, which to shed, where to send carbon, to roots searching for water, or to leaves capturing light, or to defensive compounds protecting against bark beetles, whether to open stomata, risking water loss but gaining carbon, or close them, conserving water but slowing growth. These aren't pre-programmed responses. The optimal choice depends on current conditions, recent history, likely future conditions. The tree is optimizing constantly, adjusting resource flows, responding to information from thousands of distributed sensors, and it's doing all of this while also being an ecosystem. The tree hosts lichens, mosses, insects, birds, fungi. Its canopy is a habitat. its roots are a habitat, its bark is a habitat. Hundreds of species depend on this one organism, and the tree's decisions affect all of them. The tree isn't thinking about those other species. It has no concept of ecosystem services or biodiversity. But through 3,000 years of survival, it has become integrated into the forest in ways that make it indispensable. When ancient trees are logged, ecosystems collapse. Not immediately, but gradually, as the networks they anchored fall apart, as the resources they provided disappear. The old tree wasn't just an individual, it was infrastructure. A living hub connecting dozens of other trees, hundreds of other species, cycling nutrients, stabilizing hydrology, moderating temperature. And here's what that means for how we think about intelligence. Maybe cognition isn't just something that happens inside organisms, maybe it's something that happens between them. The mycorrhizal network isn't just a communication system, it's a distributed cognitive architecture. Individual trees making local decisions based on local information, but those decisions affecting the network, which feeds back into future decisions, creating loops of causation that span the forest. No single tree knows the state of the whole forest, but the network collectively holds that information. It's distributed across thousands of connections, millions of fungal threads encoded in resource flows and chemical signals. When one part of the forest experiences stress, the network responds, resources shift, information propagates. Trees far from the initial disturbance adjust their behavior based on signals traveling through roots and fungi. The forest is thinking collectively, solving problems at scales larger than any individual tree could comprehend. And this suggests something profound about intelligence itself. Maybe it's not a property of individuals. Maybe it's a property of systems, of networks, of information flows between connected agents. Your brain works this way. No single neuron knows anything. Knowledge emerges from patterns of activity across millions of neurons, from networks strengthening and weakening, from information flowing through structured pathways. Cognition isn't in the neurons, it's in the connections, the patterns, the system-level dynamics. Trees do the same thing, just slower, through different substrates. Not neurons, but roots. Not synapses, but mycorrhizal connections. Not neurotransmitters, but chemical signals in soil. Different hardware. Same computational principles. Which raises a question we're not quite ready to answer. Where does the tree end and the forest begin? If a tree's cognition depends on information from the network, if its decisions are shaped by signals from other trees, if its survival requires connections to dozens or hundreds of other organisms, is it really an individual? Or is it a node in a larger cognitive system, the way a neuron is a node in a brain? Maybe both. Maybe individuality and collectivity aren't contradictory. Maybe a tree is simultaneously an autonomous agent and a part of something larger, just as you are simultaneously an individual and a collection of cells, each with its own boundary but all functioning as a unified whole. These aren't just philosophical puzzles. They matter for how we treat forests, how we manage land, how we think about conservation. When we cut down a 3,000-year-old tree, we're not just removing biomass, we're severing connections that took centuries to establish. We're deleting memory stored in wood. We're removing a hub that held the network together. The forest doesn't die immediately, but it becomes less resilient, less integrated, less able to buffer disturbances, to share resources, to respond collectively to threats. We're disrupting cognition at the ecosystem level, and we're doing it because we still, despite everything we've learned, think of trees as objects rather than subjects, as resources rather than beings, as things that don't think, don't remember, don't communicate, but they do, just slowly, just patiently, just in ways we're only beginning to perceive. That giant sequoia has been standing in the same spot for 3,000 years. It has felt every drought, every fire, every shift in climate. It has grown through the entire span of recorded human history. It was already ancient when Rome fell, already massive when Columbus sailed, already wise in its slow way when you were born. It knows things we don't know. It remembers things we never recorded. It has solved problems we're still struggling with. How to survive in one place for millennia, how to build structures that last, how to create resilience through connection rather than isolation. And it's still here, still growing, still adding rings, still sending signals through the network, still thinking its slow thoughts in wood and water and light. What we've forgotten, perhaps, is how to listen, how to slow down enough to perceive intelligence operating on timescales longer than our attention spans, how to recognize cognition in forms that don't look like our own. But the trees haven't forgotten. They're still speaking, still sharing, still thinking. They've been doing it since before we existed. They'll keep doing it long after we're gone, unless we stop them, unless we cut down the last ancient trees, disrupt the last intact networks, erase the last living memory of what forests were before we arrived. The choice is ours, but the intelligence was always theirs. We're just finally learning to see it.